Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today what I'm going to show you is how to tackle the 30k or Age of Darkness style Horus Heresy Salamanders. These guys have a much different armor tone than the later versions do, and it was a lot of fun finding a way to make that work as quickly as possible. So moving on along quickly, like I said, we're going to put all of the paints in the description below. Let's get started straight away. So once your Legionnaire is assembled, it's time to prime him. Now this fella I've done in two stages, starting with a black and then a light grey. It does not matter which colours you use here. If you've got access to Halford's Car Primer, or Krylon, Gracia, whatever. But I've used matte black from the Army Painter, and then from a rough sort of 45-degree angle from above, I've sprayed him with premium grey from Vallejo. Like I said, the grey doesn't matter too much, just something light, which is going to give us this neat sort of proto-zenithal effect. Now, the Salamanders in Warhammer 40,000 have quite a rich, almost emerald green kind of armor for the most part, whereas in the Horus Heresy, they tend towards a darker olive kind of finish, and I really like that look, so that's what we're going to try and recreate today. There are a couple of paints, Nocturne Green and Vulcan Green, which, to get the most out of them, you do need to do a little bit of work with highlighting and what have you. I want a one-and-done solution. Now, luckily, scale military modelers have been painting things olive green for decades. So what I have here, this is Retractive Green from Vallejo. Now, sometimes you'll see this listed as Refractive Green. The color is not always the same name, depending on the pot. But all I'm going to do is just jam this straight over the armor. Now, I will include the number for this color in the description as well. You'll see as it goes on, this has a little bit of almost yellowy warmth to it. It's a really nice olive color. There we go, one and done Salamander olive green armor. Really nice. I did come back and give it a second coat over like the top of his head and his legs, areas where it wasn't covering perfectly, but in places like his gun and his shoulder pads, it's not going to matter. What we're going to move on to now is actually laying in the base coats for his eyes, and I'm going straight to White Scar. The beautiful thing is, because we are painting in this faceplate with a brassy color later, I can be as messy as I want with this stuff. Just splodge it in, wait for this first coat to dry, and then you might give it a second. For now, that's going to look a little silly, to be honest, but it will work quite well. What I've got now is black from Vallejo. Now, you can use a Baden black, but the coverage on this, I think you'll see, is just leagues better. So I'm going to fill in black areas on his shoulder pads. I'm going to paint over the casing on his bolter with this as well. Jam it in there. And just a few other little details where I want a bit of variation in color. You see, I've already splattered on the green, but not to worry. We'll do our cleanup stage last. Now, there really isn't very much black on these guys at all. One of the things I like about the Horus Heresy era stuff is that folks always seem to have their own view on what works, and will just paint these guys however they like, which I think is really cool. Anyhow, we're going to move on to the flames, and we're going to do this now, because before we've shaded anything, it's easy to tidy them up with our base colors. So I've got my fist on red, and I'm going to paint a wiggly. Start from around here and just start poking. There we go. Irregular shapes with my brush. Now, like I mentioned, this is really more about laying down a base color, so don't worry too much if you're not getting perfect flame effects, you know, just flick lightly and away we go. Now, at the moment, that's not terribly impressive. I've laid on a lot more than I need to, because what I want to be able to do now is flip them upside down. Let's get them at the right angle there. And I'm going to go back to my black. And with a slightly finer tip on my brush this time, keep them in shot, goodness me, I'm going to start essentially carving out the flame pattern a little more nicely. Now we're cooking. I'd suggest, if you're not too sure about how you want to paint the flames, have a look at something online and just copy that pattern as close as you can. I'll move on now to Avalanche Sunset, and we're going to do something very similar here, where I am going to start a couple of millimeters in and start closely following some of the pattern that we've painted already. You can tell I'm concentrating because I am whispering. Now, rather than just strictly following the red pattern, what I've done is a few little off-centered flickies and what have you. I want that yellow to look a little bit more lively than the red. We'll move on now to some wraithbone. I'm going to use this. This is our final step. And it's just worth quickly pointing out, remember the whole time that if you make a mistake, you can just go back to the previous color. So we're now going to add our just off white heat, doing the same thing again. So there we have the fire. Now I could have done that on his leg as well, and then instead of tidying out with black to lay down that first sort of shape, I'd use the green instead. It'll work any way you want. What we'll move on to now is Retributor armor, and we're going to paint in, oh my goodness, all of that trim. There's a lot of trim. So be mindful as you're doing the shoulder pad trim here, but the others will be quite easy to do. So for along his legs and such, for example, if I just quickly... It turns out there is a lot more gold on these guys than I remembered. So you'll see one or two bits where I have splodged on the green that I want to tidy up, but try repeating to yourself that mantra, tidy up last. What I've got is Iron Hand Steel is our next color, and actually this is the last of the base coats. I'm going to apply this over, I'll let you guess, the steel parts. And this shouldn't take nearly as long as the gold at all. And now finally what I'm going to do is that fabled tidy up. So just using a little bit of that retractive green again to get rid of any of the little blips or blemishes and make things a lot sharper. And once those final steps are done, it's time to apply our all-over shade. What I'm using, this is called, well, I've called it Marine Juice. Universal Armour Wash is another popular name for it. It is an equal mix of Nuln Oil, Reikland Flesh Shade, and Lamian Medium. Now, it is important to note that I'm using the old versions of these, although if you have got the new stuff, then the Lamian Medium is probably going to get rid of the sort of gloopy contrast style effect that the new shades have. I don't know. It's up to you guys to test that one, unfortunately. What I'm going to do is just bucket this over the entire miniature. You could use Agrax Earthshade here instead if you wanted something a little simpler, but the mix shade that I'm using here, this is going to give our green just a little more warmth as well. Straight over the fire too. Don't have to be very generous with it there, but on everything else, just bucket this on. And in about half an hour, you'll have something that looks like this. Now, there are a couple of little sneaky bits in the recesses that aren't quite dry yet, but I think for the purposes of demonstrating how easy that is, well, there's our salamander. What I'm going to do now is apply a couple of decals. Well, just the one actually, but if you're going to apply any decals, make sure you do it before you do your weathering, because if you want to weather a marine, it's probably a good idea that the decals should match the rest. Now, this decal I've got was actually not manufactured in this century, so if you've got more recent ones, you'll probably find they go on a little easier. I have done a couple of videos on applying transfers in the past, so I'll link to those in the description too. Alright, that's not quite perfect, but it'll do. What I'm going to do now is paint in the eyes, and the reason why we've primed these white earlier is I'm going to use here Blood Angel's Red Contrast, and we're just going to dot this straight into the recesses. If you get any splash over, with a little Liberator Gold and a nice fine brush, you can just highlight the edge of the eye socket. And I'm going to use that Liberator Gold to highlight all of the gold. Well, whatever bits I think are going to most benefit from it. In the last real highlight I'm going to apply, I have some Necron Compound and a nice soft little dry brush. I'm using a makeup brush for this. All I'm going to do is very lightly go over the bolter and the metallic stuff on the end of it, just to define the edges of it a bit. I'm not too worried. If it ends up a little bit shiny, it will look cool. When it comes to weathering Space Marines, I've done this a few different ways on the channel before, but what I'm going to show you is a really quick method. Maybe not the nicest, but it does work. I've got here a properly ragged old brush. Something nasty, doesn't keep a tip, and it does not need to be nice at all. What I'm going to do is dab it into a little bit of Rhinox Hide. Then on my little paper I've got around here, I'm just going to dab most of that off. You'll see I'm leaving behind random shape splotches. Then I'll come up to the marine and just jab pretty roughly at the edges where I want a little bit of that scrabbly armour look. Now, it's very easy to go overboard with this, so mind that you don't lose control and put too much on, but as much of it as you like, away you go. And then with a slightly nicer brush, I've got some Strachan Green, and what I'm going to do is use this to get under the chipping that we've done and create a kind of three-dimensional effect. So dab at it from underneath, random and scraggly is fine, and just use that to call attention to those rather dark brown spots we've added. Now I've chosen to be a little more tasteful with the weathering on this guy than I ordinarily might. I tend to go a little bit overboard with them, but I quite like how that looks. What I'm going to do now is take him outside, hit him with a matte varnish, although I do recommend you're probably better off using a satin, something like Munitorum varnish. I'm using a matte because it's easier to photograph. Anyhow, I'm going to pop his base on him, and the recipe for that will be in the description. Let's get a look at what he looks like when he's all finished. So there at last, our salamander is complete, and I've thoroughly enjoyed painting him. This is a method that will work much more quickly on your Mark IV or your Mark VI Marines, because, man, these Mark III with all of that trim does slow down the process a bit. But I think as well, by sticking to such bright colours to put the fire on, once we throw that shade over the top, it keeps that richness of colour, still works really well. So as always, thank you very much to Exit23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my wonderful producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support lets me keep buying Space Marines. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.